The train hissed to a stop in the dusty town of Clearwater, and that's when he saw her standing alone on the platform, clutching a small suitcase, tears streaking her face. The others whispered cruelly, "She's the one they left behind, too fat for the groom to claim." The widower, Henry Cole, watched from the edge of the crowd a man who'd buried his wife and his hope years ago. But when the woman met his eyes, something in her broke him wide open. She didn't beg, didn't cry, just straightened her shoulders and said, "Guess no one wants me." Henry stepped forward, tipped his hat and said, "Reckon that's not true, ma'am. If you'll have me, I'll marry you right now." Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The air hung thick with dust and disbelief as Henry Cole stepped forward through the murmuring crowd, the brim of his hat shadowing eyes that hadn't known warmth in a long, long time. Martha Whitfield stood before him, clutching her worn suitcase, as if it were the only solid thing left in her world. Her cheeks flushed from equal parts, shame and Sunday. Around them, the whispers curled like snakes cruel, thin voices carrying laughter that bit sharper than any blade. "Poor fool," someone muttered. "She'll eat him out of house and home." But Henry didn't hear them, or maybe he just didn't care anymore. His hand found hers, rough calluses meeting soft, trembling skin, and when he looked at her, truly looked, he didn't see what the others did. He saw a woman left standing in the wreckage of someone else's cruelty, a woman who hadn't run, who'd kept her chin up even as the world tried to push her down. "Reckon that's not true, ma'am," he'd said, tipping his hat, his voice steadier than he felt. "If you'll have me, I'll marry you right now." For a heartbeat, the platform seemed to hold its breath. Martha blinked up at him, her lips parting, a tear carving a clean line down her dusty cheek. "You can't mean that," she whispered. "I do," he said simply. And something in the plainness of his words, the honesty, made her shoulders straighten. The station master, half stunned, stammered something about needing a witness. And before anyone could think twice, the town's preacher stepped forward from the ticket line, Bible in hand. His expression caught somewhere between confusion and awe. "Well, I suppose there's no law against it," he murmured. "If both parties are of sound mind." "Sound enough," Henry replied, offering a small, crooked smile. The preacher cleared his throat and began the words, his voice rising above the murmurs. A few of the bystanders gathered closer, drawn in by the spectacle of it, a man they all knew to be a widower, quiet and broken, marrying the woman the world had decided wasn't worth keeping. Martha's hand trembled in Henry's, her eyes darting once toward the road that led back out of town. But when she looked back up at him, what she saw there, calm, steady kindness, held her fast. "Do you, Henry Cole, take this woman?" The preacher's words blurred into the hum of wind and train smoke, and Henry's answer came low, certain. "I do." When the moment came for her to speak, Martha hesitated just long enough for the laughter in the crowd to start again, a nervous titter at her silence. But then she lifted her chin, her voice clear, though it shook. "I do," she said. It was enough to quiet every snicker. The preacher closed the Bible with a soft thud and pronounced them man and wife, right there between the rails and the prairie wind. For a second, no one moved. Then the train whistle screamed, scattering the silence like birds. Henry turned to her, releasing a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Mrs. Cole," he said softly, trying the words as though they might vanish if he spoke them too loud. She blinked up at him, still dazed, and then just barely smiled. The onlookers muttered as he took her suitcase, leading her down the platform. Some called it foolish, others pitied him. But one thing was clear. Henry Cole, the man who'd lived half his life in mourning, had done something no one expected. As they walked away, hand in hand, the crowd faded behind them. And for the first time in years, Henry felt his heart beating steady and alive, carrying him toward a life neither of them had planned but both might finally deserve. The sun was sinking low by the time the wagon rolled out of Clearwater, the wheels crunching over gravel and dry weeds as the laughter of the crowd faded into the distance behind them. Henry kept his eyes on the trail ahead, reins loose in his hands, though his mind spun with the weight of what he'd just done. Beside him, Martha sat stiff and silent, her suitcase wedged between her boots, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. The wind tugged strands of hair from her bun, and she brushed them back without a word, staring at the endless line of horizon as though afraid to look at him. He tried a few times to speak, asked if she was comfortable, if she was warm enough, if she wanted to stop and rest, but each time, her answers came short and careful. Polite in tone, but carrying a wall he didn't know how to cross. He couldn't blame her. She'd been humiliated in front of half the town and married to a stranger in the same breath. He'd acted on instinct, a pull in his chest he still couldn't explain, and now, with every creak of the wagon, that decision settled heavier on his shoulders. The ride stretched long through the open plains, the sky bleeding into gold and violet. Coyotes called somewhere in the distance. At one point, Henry glanced sideways and caught her watching the sunset just for a moment. Her expression softened, her eyes reflecting the orange light like embers. He almost said something then, something about how beautiful the land looked when it was quiet like this, but he stopped himself. She didn't need pretty words from him. She needed time. When they finally turned up the road to his ranch, the wind carried the faint scent of hay and dust. The house came into view sturdy but worn, the porch rail missing a slat, the paint faded to a tired gray. Martha's breath hitched faintly as she took it in. It wasn't much, but it stood solid against the endless stretch of prairie, a lonely mark of someone's will to keep going. "Ain't fancy," Henry said as he pulled the wagon to a stop, his voice hesitant, almost apologetic. "But it holds through winter, and don't leak much when it rains." She didn't answer at first, just climbed down carefully, smoothing her skirt, her gaze sweeping across the yard. The barn doors creaked, the windmill turned slow and steady, and in the corral, an old mare lifted her head to watch them. "It's clean," she said finally, her voice small but certain, and quiet. Henry managed a faint smile. Quiet's about all it's been. He took her suitcase before she could protest and carried it inside, his boots echoing on the wood floor. The place smelled faintly of pine soap and old smoke tidy, but with a hollowness that spoke of years spent alone. Dust shimmered in the evening light filtering through the curtains. There were only 2 chairs at the table, a single cup and plate left on the counter, and a Bible resting on the mantel beside a faded photograph of a woman and a young boy. Martha noticed it but said nothing. Henry set the suitcase by the door of the master bedroom, the only one with a proper bed and window, and turned toward her. For a moment, the silence between them stretched again, awkward but not unfriendly. "You're home now," he said simply, the words quiet but heavy with meaning. She blinked, startled, her lips parting as though she wanted to correct him, to remind him this wasn't really her home, not yet. But the look in his eyes stopped her, a steady warmth that asked nothing, expected nothing, just offered. "Thank you," she whispered, her throat tight. He tipped his hat, the faintest ghost of a smile touching his weathered face. "Supper's simple, but it's hot," he said, nodding toward the stove. "I'll bring in water if you'd like to wash up first." And as he stepped out into the fading light, Martha stood alone in the doorway of her new life, listening to the creak of the windmill and the slow rhythm of a heart she hadn't realized had begun to hope again. The days that followed settled into a rhythm of quiet labor, each sunrise breaking over the hills to find 2 strangers living side by side beneath the same roof yet worlds apart in silence. Martha rose before dawn each morning, her footsteps soft on the wood floor, the smell of fresh biscuits and coffee drifting through the house long before Henry stirred from his bed. She spoke little, moving through the chores like someone long practiced in the art of being invisible, sweeping, scrubbing, mending, all without calling attention to herself. When Henry came in from the fields at dusk, tired and dust-covered, he'd find supper waiting, a plate kept warm by the fire, a clean cup beside the coffee pot. She never sat with him to eat, never lingered to talk. She'd simply nod and retreat to her sewing or the dishes, her presence a quiet constant he couldn't ignore. The ranch itself began to feel different. Not louder, not livelier, but gentler somehow. The sharp emptiness that had once filled the place started to soften around the edges, replaced by the faint hum of her voice as she worked, or the rhythmic creak of the rocking chair on the porch in the evenings. Henry didn't understand how something so small could change the air of a home so completely, but he felt it all the same, like the land itself had taken a deep breath after years of holding it in. Still, he kept his distance. The ghost of his late wife lingered in every shadow, in the soft smell of lavender that clung to the old quilt at the foot of his bed, in the framed photograph that refused to gather dust no matter how long it hung on the mantel. He wasn't sure what he felt for Martha, pity, gratitude, or the faint echo of something that scared him to name, but he knew she deserved better than his silence. Yet words didn't come easy to Henry Cole. So instead, he worked. From dawn till dusk, he lost himself in the rhythm of the land, mending fences, breaking new ground, hauling feed to the cattle. The muscles in his back ached, his hands split and bled, but the ache was familiar, a pain he knew how to live with. What he didn't know how to face was the warmth that began to creep back into his life with every quiet act she offered him. One morning, he found his work shirt hanging neatly on the chair by the door, the tear at the shoulder stitched with care. Another evening, he came in after a long day to find the lamp burning low, a note beside his plate that simply read, "You missed dinner, but there's still stew." Her handwriting was tidy, deliberate, each word carrying a quiet dignity that reminded him of how she'd stood on the platform that first day, humiliated but unbroken. He started catching himself listening for her voice when he came in from the fields, that soft hum she carried with her as naturally as breath. It wasn't a song he recognized, maybe something from her childhood, maybe something she made up as she worked, but it filled the house with a warmth that made the ghosts retreat just a little further into the corners. One night, as he sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the last light fade from the hills, he realized he hadn't felt the ache of loneliness in days. Martha passed behind him then, her lantern casting gold over the yard, and he caught the faint scent of soap and bread as she went. "Evenin'," she said quietly, not looking his way. "Evenin'," he answered, his voice softer than he meant it to be. She disappeared into the house, and Henry stared out over the land that had once felt more like a grave than a home. The wind was cold, the stars sharp, but somewhere deep inside, something was starting to thaw slow and stubborn, like winter giving way to spring. The wagon wheels rattled against the packed dirt of Main Street as Henry and Martha Cole rode into Clearwater under the mid-morning sun, the air thick with heat and the faint sound of piano music drifting from the saloon. It was their first trip to town together since the wedding on that same platform months ago, and though Martha sat straight beside him, hands clasped tightly in her lap, Henry could feel the tension humming off her like the charge before a storm. Folks stopped what they were doing when they saw them, a few pausing mid-step, others pretending to mind their own business while whispering behind gloved hands. Henry kept his gaze fixed ahead, jaw tight, trying to ignore the prickling at the back of his neck. He knew how this town talked. It had a way of taking small truths and twisting them until they bled. But Martha, bless her, had no such armor. Her eyes darted toward every smirk, every sneer. The words drifted on the wind just loud enough to wound. "That's her, the one nobody wanted." Someone muttered from the mercantile porch. "Widowmaker took pity, I reckon." Another snickered. Or maybe just got desperate. Henry felt the muscle in his jaw jump. He'd lived long enough not to care what people said about him, but hearing them spit their poison at her, the woman who'd worked her hands raw, keeping his home alive, stirred something fierce in him he hadn't felt in years. Martha slipped off the wagon before he could help her, head lowered, skirts brushing the dust. Inside the store, she moved quietly through the aisles, gathering what they needed: flour, coffee, a bit of fabric for mending, while the storekeeper's wife whispered to a friend in the corner. When Martha turned to pay, her hands shook just enough for Henry to notice. "Put it on my account," he said, his voice low, controlled. The storekeeper nodded quickly, pretending not to notice the silence that followed them out the door. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder as they stepped into the open air, crueler, sharper, feeding off one another like flies on a carcass. "Heard she was left on the train like unwanted freight," a ranch hand laughed. "Fat as she is. Surprised the wagon made it this far." The sound of laughter broke through the street like a gunshot, and something in Henry snapped clean in two. He stopped walking. Martha froze beside him, her face pale beneath the brim of her bonnet, her fingers clutching the basket until the handle bit into her palm. Henry turned slowly, eyes hard as iron. "Say that again," he said, voice low and steady, the kind of tone that carried more danger than shouting ever could. The laughter faltered. A few men shifted uneasily. "Didn't mean nothing by it, Cole," one muttered. "Just talkin'." Henry took a step forward, the boards of the walkway creaking beneath his boots. "That's Mrs. Cole," he said, loud enough for everyone in earshot to hear, his words cutting through the lazy hum of town life like a whip crack. "And she's the best thing to happen to me, better than any of you sorry fools ever deserved." The street went silent. Even the horses seemed to stop shifting. The ranch hand's smirk vanished, replaced by the color draining from his face. Martha stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest, the basket trembling slightly in her grip. Henry's hand brushed hers, not a touch for show, not for comfort, but something solid and steady, a promise spoken without words. "Let's go, darlin'," he said quietly, his voice softer now but still firm. She looked up at him, eyes wide with disbelief, then nodded. As they walked down the street, the same townsfolk who'd laughed before now stepped aside, hats coming off, eyes turning away. The piano from the saloon picked up again, tentative at first, then steady, as though the world had decided to keep turning but with a little more care. When they reached the wagon, Martha climbed up without a word, but Henry saw the way her shoulders had straightened, the faint tremor in her breath replaced by something stronger. He took the reins and glanced sideways at her. She didn't meet his gaze, but her lips moved just enough for him to hear the faintest whisper. "Thank you." He tipped his hat, eyes on the road ahead. "Ain't nothing to thank me for," he said. "Just told the truth." As they rode away, the town faded behind them, and though the wind still carried traces of gossip, it could no longer touch them because everyone in Clearwater now knew exactly who Martha Cole was. The fire crackled low in the hearth that night, throwing soft light across the cabin walls, the air thick with wood smoke and unspoken things. Henry sat at the edge of the table, shoulders slumped, his hands clasped before him, while Martha moved quietly through the room, setting aside the last of the dishes, her movements slow and deliberate. The events of the day still clung to them, both the stares, the laughter, the sudden silence after his words on Main Street, but it wasn't shame that hung between them now. It was something heavier, older, rooted in the ghosts each of them carried. When she finally settled into the chair across from him, the lamplight caught the faint weariness in her face, the small smudge of flour on her sleeve, the steadiness in her gaze that had become the quiet heart of this home. For a long while, neither spoke. Outside, the wind pressed against the walls, whispering through the cracks like a restless spirit, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called into the dark. Henry's throat worked before he found the words. "I reckon I owe you truth," he said finally, his voice low and uneven, as if dragged from someplace deep and long locked away. "Back there, when I said I'd marry you, I didn't think, didn't plan it. Just saw you standing there on that platform, and it hit me like a thunderclap. Felt like if I turned away, I'd be leaving something I wasn't meant to lose." He ran a hand over his face, the lines around his eyes deepening in the firelight. "It wasn't pity, not even close. But I didn't rightly understand it either. Still don't." Martha listened, hands folded loosely in her lap, her expression unreadable but kind. She didn't interrupt, didn't move, only watched him with that quiet patience that had unsettled him from the start. He drew in a shaky breath, his gaze drifting toward the mantel where the old photograph of his late wife still stood. "Her name was Clara," he said, softly, and the sound of it seemed to hollow the air between them. "She was 20 when we married. Sweet as spring, stubborn as a mule. We built this place together from nothing. Then she got with child. Whole town said it'd make us whole, but—" His voice caught, the words breaking before he could stop them. He swallowed hard, eyes fixed on the flame. "She went into labor too soon. The boy, he didn't make it. Neither did she. That was 8 years ago, and I ain't felt right since. Buried 'em both out past the cottonwoods." The silence that followed was so complete. It felt like the world itself had paused to listen. The fire popped, the wind sighed, and Martha's eyes glistened in the light, though she didn't weep. "I used to talk to her," Henry continued quietly, almost to himself. "Talk to the wind, the house, the empty chair, anything that'd listen. Then one day, I stopped. Couldn't stand the sound of my own voice anymore. Then that day at the station happened, and I saw you, and it was like the air came back in my lungs for the first time since." His hands tightened on the table, his voice rough. Maybe it wasn't sense or logic or God's hand. Maybe it was just a man who'd been empty too long, seeing someone who was broken same as him. He looked up at her then, meeting her gaze across the flickering light. "But I need you to know I didn't buy you to fill a hole, Martha. I just didn't want either of us standing alone no more." For a moment she said nothing, only studied him with a stillness that seemed to soften the air. Then she rose from her chair and crossed the small space between them, her steps quiet but certain. She laid a hand on his shoulder, her touch light, steady, like the settling of snow. "You married me," she said gently, her voice barely above a whisper, "because your heart knew what your head couldn't say." The words hit him harder than a confession, simple and true, cutting through the years of silence he'd built like a wall around himself. His breath shuddered out of him, his eyes closing as if the weight of the world had finally shifted. When he opened them again, she was still there, solid, unflinching, the firelight painting warmth across her tired features. For the first time since he could remember, Henry smiled. Not the polite kind he'd given townsfolk or the half-hearted ones he wore for show, but something small, honest, and fragile. "You make it sound like I'm worth something again," he murmured. Martha's hand lingered on his shoulder. "You always were," she said softly. "You just forgot how to see it." And as the wind outside quieted and the fire burned low, two broken hearts, bound by loss, began to beat in rhythm for the first time, not as strangers, not as debtors of fate, but as souls who'd somehow found each other in the ruins of grief. The first bolt came down so close that the sound seemed to tear the sky in half, a jagged white flash that lit the fields like daylight for one blinding instant, before plunging everything into darkness again. Henry was at the far end of the pasture when he saw it strike, a spear of fire sinking straight into the old barn roof, and within seconds orange light was blooming against the horizon, spreading fast through the dry timber. The storm was rolling heavy over the prairie, thunder shaking the earth beneath his boots as he ran, rain beginning to fall in cold, slanted sheets that did little to fight the flames. "Martha!" he shouted, his voice lost in the wind. He could see her silhouette near the barn doors, small and fierce against the blaze, her skirts whipping around her legs as she fought to unbar the latch. "Get back!" he yelled, but she didn't even glance his way. The crackle of fire and the panicked cries of horses drowned everything else out. The air smelled of smoke and fear, and then he saw why she wouldn't move. The mare had kicked her foal's stall door shut in terror, the little thing thrashing inside, trapped in the heat and smoke. Before he could reach her, Martha ducked into the building, the fire curling like serpents above her head. Henry's heart stopped. He sprinted harder, his boots slipping in the mud, the heat hitting him in waves so fierce it stung his skin. "Martha!" he roared again, his voice breaking this time. The rain hissed where it met the flames, steam rising like ghosts into the storm. He reached the barn door just as she stumbled out, her arms wrapped tight around the trembling foal, her dress singed, her face streaked with soot and tears. The animal screamed once, terrified, then went still in her grasp as she dragged it through the mud, coughing hard, eyes squeezed shut against the smoke. Henry caught her under the arms, pulling her clear as the roof collapsed behind them with a sound like the earth splitting open. The two of them fell to the ground together, the foal between them, its small body shaking as rain poured down. For a moment, all Henry could do was stare at her, the mess of her hair, the black smudges across her face, the raw fear and defiance in her eyes as she clutched the animal like it was her own child. "You could have died," he said hoarsely, but his voice came out more like a prayer than a scolding. She coughed, trying to catch her breath, then looked up at him through the rain. "Couldn't leave it," she rasped. "Wouldn't." The words were simple, but they hit him harder than the thunder. She wasn't just brave. She was the kind of woman who didn't wait for someone else to do what was right, who ran headfirst into the fire because her heart wouldn't let her do anything less. He'd known men who'd bragged about courage, men who'd drawn guns over pride or chased storms to prove themselves, but he'd never seen anyone face down death for something as small and helpless as a foal. He pulled his coat from his shoulders and wrapped it around her, the gesture clumsy but desperate, his hands shaking as he brushed a smear of soot from her cheek. "You're out of your damn mind," he whispered, but there was no anger in it, only awe. She smiled weakly, her lips trembling, rainwater cutting clean lines through the dirt on her face. "Takes one to know one," she said. The foal gave a soft whinny, pressing its head into her lap, alive and safe. And for a long time they just sat there in the rain, surrounded by the wreckage of what they'd built. The barn was gone, the storm still roaring above them, but none of it mattered. Henry couldn't look away from her, from the stubborn strength written in every line of her face, the wildness of her spirit shining through the soot and tears. And right then, kneeling in the mud beside the woman who'd walked through fire without hesitation, Henry Cole realized that he'd never met anyone braver, anyone truer. The storm had taken his barn, but it had given him something far greater, a reason to believe that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't done living yet. The dawn crept slow and pale over the prairie, washing the world in gray after a night of thunder and fire. The barn still smoldered in the distance, black smoke curling lazy into the new light. But Henry's eyes weren't on it. They were on the woman lying in his bed, her breathing shallow, her skin clammy with fever. Martha had collapsed not long after the fire was out, her strength finally giving way once the danger had passed. He'd carried her inside through the rain, her weight light in his arms despite her broad shoulders, her head lolling against his chest as he laid her down beneath the old quilt. The smell of smoke clung to her hair, her hands blistered and raw from the heat. But she was alive, thank God. She was alive. Henry hadn't prayed in years, not since Clara died, but he found himself muttering words into the dark he barely remembered. Promises to anyone listening that if she just woke up, he'd do better, be better, whatever it took. Now, as morning settled across the ranch, he sat beside her with a bowl of broth gone lukewarm, his large hands awkward and uncertain as he dipped the spoon and lifted it to her lips. "Come on, darlin'," he murmured, his voice soft, roughened by sleepless hours. "You got too much stubborn in you to give up now." Her lashes fluttered once, then stilled again, her breathing ragged. He wiped her forehead with a cool cloth, his thumb lingering against her temple, tracing the faint smudge of soot that still clung there. Every so often, her fingers twitched like she was dreaming, and he caught himself wondering what she saw behind closed eyes, if it was the fire, or her past, or something else entirely. The house felt different now, filled with a stillness that wasn't lonely but waiting, like the whole place was holding its breath for her to come back to it. He thought about all the nights he'd spent alone at this same bedside, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind, thinking the world had already taken everything it could from him. But now, watching her chest rise and fall, he realized how wrong he'd been. There was always more left to lose. Hours passed before she stirred again, a faint sound escaping her throat, somewhere between a sigh and a question. Henry leaned forward, his heart kicking hard in his chest. "Easy now," he said, his voice catching. Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then finding him. For a long moment, she just looked at him, her brow furrowed in confusion, like she wasn't sure if he was real. "You didn't have to stay," she whispered, her voice weak and cracked, but the words steady enough to break him. He let out a shaky laugh, more breath than sound, and shook his head. "Reckon I did," he said simply. "You're my wife." The words hung between them, plain and heavy with meaning. She blinked, a faint smile tugging at her lips even as her eyes filled. "You didn't buy a wife that day," she murmured, her hand moving weakly toward his. "You bought yourself a fool." He caught her fingers before they fell, wrapping them in his calloused hand, warm and firm. "Maybe so," he said, his thumb brushing gently over her knuckles. "But I'd do it again, every damn time." She laughed softly, then a fragile, broken sound, but alive. He felt something tighten in his chest, that quiet ache of joy and fear tangled together. For a while, they just stayed like that, her hand in his, the sun slowly creeping across the floorboards. Outside, the land steamed where rain had met fire, the air heavy with the scent of ash and renewal. Henry reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his touch as careful as if she were made of glass. "Get your rest, Martha," he said softly. "We'll rebuild what's lost when you're ready." Her eyes fluttered closed again, her breathing deep and steady now, and Henry sat there long after she drifted off, the weight of the long night, easing at last. The barn could be raised again, the fences mended, the stock replaced, but the woman in his bed, the fire that burned in her that was irreplaceable. As he watched her sleep, her face calm beneath the soft morning light, Henry realized the truth he'd been too afraid to name. He hadn't just saved her from the flames that night. She'd saved him from the ones he'd been carrying for years. The months that followed melted one into the next, and with each passing sunrise, the land and the people upon it began to heal. The ashes of the burned barn gave way to green shoots, wildflowers rising stubbornly from the blackened soil as though refusing to remember the fire. The air lost its bitter edge, replaced by the hum of bees, the lowing of cattle, the steady rhythm of life returning. Henry and Martha worked side by side through it all, their days filled with labor that didn't just rebuild the ranch, it rebuilt them. When she was strong enough to walk again, she insisted on helping with the new barn, tying back her hair with a strip of linen, rolling up her sleeves, and matching him swing for swing with the hammer. At first, Henry protested, saying the doctor told her to rest, but she just smiled that small, determined smile of hers and said, "Rest is for the dying, and I ain't planning on that anytime soon." He couldn't argue with that. Together they built something better than what the storm had taken, each board nailed with the kind of care only born from loss. When the roof went up, he caught her watching it, her eyes shining in the golden light of afternoon. "You've a good hand, Martha," he said softly, the name slipping from him less like formality now and more like reverence. She smiled without looking at him. "So do you, Henry." The sound of his name on her tongue made him forget the ache in his back, the years that had hollowed him out. He'd long thought love was something that ended a flame that burned bright and fast, then faded into memory, but now he saw it could grow slow, quiet, like roots taking hold beneath the earth where no one could see. The ranch itself seemed to change with them. The garden she planted behind the house flourished, herbs and beans twisting up from the soil, sunflowers standing tall enough to catch the dawn before it touched the house. New foals were born in the spring, calves stumbled on unsteady legs in the field, and for the first time in years, laughter filled the air, not forced or fleeting, but deep and easy. Sometimes he'd find her in the kitchen, humming softly as she kneaded bread, the sunlight spilling through the window to warm her face, and he'd stand in the doorway just watching, feeling something settle peaceful and right inside his chest. She'd glance up then, catch him staring, and tease, "You plan to help or just stand there looking foolish?" And he'd grin in spite of himself, roll up his sleeves, and join her. Evenings became their quiet ritual, the two of them sitting on the porch after supper, coffee cups in hand, watching the horizon fade to red. They didn't always talk. They didn't need to. Sometimes, when the crickets began to sing and the last light slipped away, he'd murmur her name, Martha, not like he was calling her, but like he was holding something precious on his tongue. Each time he said it, it sounded a little softer, a little more like a prayer, and she'd turn her head toward him, her eyes catching the firelight, and smile that slow, knowing smile that told him she understood everything he couldn't put into words. The folks in Clearwater began to notice the change, too. The ranch that had once been whispered about as a lonely man's burden now thrived, fields full, fences mended, laughter carrying clear across the valley. When Henry rode into town, people nodded in greeting instead of gossiping, and when Martha joined him, they tipped their hats. But none of that mattered to him half as much as the sound of her laughter, the way she'd reach for his arm when the wind blew cold, or the sight of her walking through the fields in the morning, her skirts brushing the golden grass. There were still hard days, droughts and sickness, and the ache of old memories that never fully went away, but the weight of them felt lighter now, shared. He'd wake sometimes in the quiet, hours before dawn, the warmth of her beside him, and realize he was no longer waiting for life to hurt again. He was living it, fully, finally. And when the sun rose and he spoke her name, Martha, it wasn't just a name anymore. It was home. The day the stagecoach rolled into Clearwater, the sky was the color of old iron, heavy with the promise of rain. Henry had ridden into town with Martha to pick up a shipment of seed, their wagon creaking under the weight of a good harvest behind them. It should have been an ordinary trip, quick stop, a few words with the storekeeper, then home before dark. But the moment the coach door opened and a tall, gaunt man stepped down onto the dirt street, everything shifted. Martha froze mid-step, the color draining from her face. Henry felt her hand falter on the reins, her breath hitch like she'd seen a ghost. The man wasn't much to look at now, thin as fence wire, eyes sunken, clothes that once might have been fine now wrinkled and dust-stained, but there was something in the way he carried himself, a swagger worn dull by time and failure. He scanned the street until his gaze landed on Martha, and when he smiled, it was the kind that left a sour taste in the air. "Well, I'll be damned," he drawled, tipping his hat like they were old friends. "Didn't think you'd still be here, Maggie." The name no one had called her in years hung in the silence like a blade. Martha's mouth opened, but no sound came. Henry shifted in his saddle, feeling the old heat of anger rise slow in his chest. He'd never seen this man before, but he knew the type: smooth talker, quick liar, the kind who thought decency was something for other people. "What do you want?" Henry asked, his voice steady but low, carrying enough steel to turn a few heads nearby. The man's grin faltered for half a heartbeat before he found it again. "Ain't your concern, friend. I'm here for my wife." The word dropped like a stone. Martha flinched, her fingers gripping the edge of the wagon so hard her knuckles went white. The street went still. Even the horses seemed to pause, their breath loud in the sudden quiet. Henry swung down from the saddle, his boots landing solid, in the dirt. "Your wife?" he repeated, slow and deliberate. "Far as I can tell, you left her standing on a train platform like baggage you couldn't be bothered to carry." The man's eyes flicked with something mean. "That was a misunderstanding," he said quickly. "Got caught up in things, business gone bad. Debts. I had to cut loose some weight till I could get back on my feet." He looked Martha over then, a sneer curling his lip. "Looks like she landed soft, though. Ranch, husband, hell, she should be thanking me for it." A murmur rippled through the small crowd that had gathered: farmers, shopkeepers, a few kids staring wide-eyed. Henry took a step closer, close enough now that the man could see the calm in his eyes wasn't weakness. "You lost your chance the day you let her stand alone," he said, his voice carrying down the street like thunder rolling low across the hills. "She's mine now, and she's worth more than you'll ever be." The man blinked, his jaw working soundlessly as if the words had knocked the wind clean out of him. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then he spat in the dirt, muttered something about country fools, and turned on his heel, climbing back into the stagecoach with all the grace of a man who'd been measured and found wanting. The horses kicked up dust as they pulled away, the wheels rattling down the road until the sound faded into the wind. Henry stood there a long moment, the tension slowly bleeding from his shoulders, before he turned back to Martha. She was trembling, her eyes shining with unshed tears, but she stood tall. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. He gave a small, tired smile, brushing a bit of dust from her sleeve. "Reckon I did. Wouldn't be much of a husband if I didn't stand up for my wife." For a long moment they just looked at each other, the noise of the town drifting away around them. Then she reached out and took his hand right there in the middle of Main Street, where everyone could see, and said softly, "You didn't just stand up for me, Henry. You showed him what a man really is." He squeezed her hand back, gentle but sure, and when they climbed back into the wagon, the whispers that followed weren't cruel this time. They were the kind born of respect. And as the first drops of rain began to fall, Henry glanced at her beside him, thinking that sometimes the past didn't come back to haunt, it came back to remind a man just how far he'd come. Years slipped away like dust over the prairie, carried on the wind but never truly gone. And with them went the whispers that had once followed Henry and Martha Cole through every street and supper table in Clearwater. In the beginning, folks had called it foolishness, the widower taking in the woman left behind, the fat bride, too stubborn to know when she wasn't wanted. But as the seasons turned, the story changed, reshaped by what people could see with their own eyes. Where there had once been a half-broken ranch and a lonely man, there now stood a place that breathed with life, fences sturdy, crops golden, laughter echoing from the porch to the barn and back again. Children's voices carried on the wind, 3 of them, all dark-haired and bright-eyed, racing through the tall grass barefoot while the dogs barked and chased at their heels. The house that had once been quiet enough to hear your own heartbeat now rang with songs, arguments, and the kind of noise only love could build. Henry, his hair turned silver and his back bent from years of work, sat most evenings on the porch with Martha beside him, her hand resting over his knee, her eyes soft with that same steady light he'd fallen for all those years ago. Time had changed them both, carved new lines across their faces, slowed their steps, softened the sharp edges of youth, but it hadn't dimmed them. If anything, it had made them stronger, rooted them deeper into the land and into each other. Henry still rose early, though now it was to watch the sun come up rather than to chase cattle or patch fences. He liked to say the mornings belonged to him and Martha, that the rest of the day could have the world but dawn was theirs. She'd bring him his coffee, scold him for not wearing his coat, and he'd grin that same slow grin that made her roll her eyes but blush all the same. There was a rhythm to their life, one built not from grand gestures or declarations but from the thousand small things that stitched two souls together over time. The townsfolk who'd once mocked them now sent their children to visit, to learn from Mrs. Cole's good sense, or Mr. Cole's patience. The younger couples, wide-eyed and unsure, often stopped by for advice, and Henry would just chuckle, glance at Martha, and say, "All you need's a bit of kindness and a lot of forgiveness. The rest'll sort itself out." In the evenings, when the air cooled and the land turned gold under the sinking sun, they'd sit side by side on the porch, watching the fields ripple like water. The children would tumble in from their play, begging for one more story before bed, and Martha would oblige telling them of trains and fire, of storms and courage, of how a woman once stood alone on a station platform, and a man too broken to feel anything saw her and decided that maybe his heart wasn't done after all. Henry never interrupted when she told that story. He'd just watch her, the way her lips curved around the words, the way her eyes still shone when she spoke of that day. When she finished, he'd reach for her hand, old and worn but warm as ever, and hold it in his. "You know," he'd say, his voice gravelly with age, "folks used to say I saved you that day." And she'd smile, turning toward him, that same smile that had once silenced a whole town. "Maybe," she'd reply softly, "but I think we both know who really saved who." And as the stars came out, lighting the sky above their quiet home, the sound of laughter and the gentle creak of the rocking chairs would drift into the night, proof that love, once found in the ashes of loneliness, could grow into something lasting, something good. So when travelers rode past the Boone Ranch in later years and saw the couple on the porch, weathered but smiling, they didn't see the mockery or the pity that had started their story. They saw what it had become, a life built not from luck or beauty or chance, but from faith, grit, and two hearts that had refused to give up on each other.